Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CEVAW Network webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking to you about Women's Safety Index and data platform that is going to be released on the CEVAW evidence platform today. And we're really excited to be giving you a sneak preview of the work that we've been doing behind the scenes. And we genuinely will appreciate your thoughts and comments and questions during the webinar and afterwards. I'm Sarah Davies. I'm the CEVAW Deputy Director for the Indo-Pacific Research, and I'm honoured to be hosting this webinar today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country on which I'm located, the land of the Turrbal people north of Meanjin River and the Jagera people south of Meanjin River, and I acknowledge their unique connection with this place for thousands of years. I acknowledge the Torres Strait Island peoples as the traditional owners of the Torres Strait Islands, and I acknowledge all traditional owners and Indigenous peoples across the Pacific, Asia, and Oceania. I acknowledge this land, the river, its people, rich and dreaming, and pay our respects to ancestors, elders, and leaders of the future. I walk gently on this land, and I acknowledge that it was never ceded. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to briefly go through 2 slides just for your attention. The first one refers to webinar etiquette that we would sincerely appreciate you to observe and follow during this webinar. And I'll give you time to just very briefly have a look at those little tiles there. And then we would also like to give you time to also look at supports that are available should any of the conversation today in any way be triggering or traumatic for yourself. And we sincerely hope that you can look at these support information and reach out to us if indeed you need any of those supports to be made available to you. You can reach out to us via the Q&A and we can make sure that we can privately communicate those supports to you. So it's my absolute delight now to introduce to you the speakers of today's webinar. We have Professor Jacqui True, Dr. Katie Buchhorn, and Michelle Higelin. Jacqui is a Professor of International Relations and Director of the Australian Research Council of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, what we call CEVAW, and she is a Global Fellow, Peace Research Institute at PRIO in Oslo, and received an honorary doctorate from Lund University, Sweden in 2018. Her research focuses on gendered political violence, feminist political economy, and the women, peace and security agenda. Dr. Katie Buchhorn is CEVAW's data scientist, having completed her PhD at Queensland University of Technology, specialising in Bayesian statistics and machine learning. Katie brings a diverse background, having initially studied theoretical mathematics before spending years in the financial sector as a quantitative risk analysis. Michelle Higelin is the Executive Director of ActionAid Australia with over 25 years experience advancing women's rights nationally and globally. And of course, ActionAid Australia is a CEVAW partner. Michelle previously served as Deputy General Secretary of the World YWCA and has advised UN agencies, including the UNFPA, also a CEVAW partner, and the World Food Programme. Michelle has chaired the NGO Working Group on Peace at the United Nations and is also Vice President of the Australian Council for International Development and co-chair of the Australian Civil Society Coalition on Women, Peace and Security, of which I am very honoured to be a member. Before we begin, I'd like to just gently remind you again that we have a Q&A function for questions. Feel free to start entering those questions anytime you wish to. We have 2 wonderful research fellows from CEVAW, Dr. Rafat Mahmood and Dr. Piu Piu U, who will be answering those questions in real time, should you like to have them answered sooner rather than later. And of course, you can direct questions to Jacqui, Katie, or Michelle at any stage during the webinar, and we'll make sure that they have time to answer them. We are also going to provide a link to the evidence platform near the end of the webinar so that you're able to go and start exploring the Women's Safety Index yourself. Now I will turn over to our Director, Jacqui True, to introduce the aims of the Women's Safety Index. Thank you, Jacqui.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and for that beautiful acknowledgement of country. Well, a question we've been asking in CEVAW is how safe are women globally? Existing quantitative data on violence against women to answer this question is actually extremely limited. But qualitative research does give us rich insight into women's experiences and the conditions that shape women's safety. These conditions we consider the foundations of women's safety. They ensure that women are least vulnerable to violence. So to study these conditions, our CEVAW team, led by Dr. Katie Buchhorn, has created the Women's Safety Index, or for short, WSI. The index combines structural and societal conditions that protect women from violence. It also considers shocks, such as conflicts or natural disasters, which often undermine women's safety and increase the risks of violence to them. Well, what is the Women's Safety Index? Let me describe the main dimensions of this index that you can see here on the slide. So the index is built around three main dimensions: equity, protection, and resources. First, the equity dimension measures the fairness and inclusiveness of society across education, employment, parliamentary representation, poverty levels, and the absence of legal discrimination. Second, the protection dimension measures the institutional protection of women's bodily integrity through their autonomy over fertility, support to lower maternal mortality, the presence of non-violent attitudes, and the prohibition of child marriage. And third, the resources dimension measures women's access to essential resources that support their security and autonomy, including safe water and sanitation, which is so important for women's health, electricity, mobile phone use, and financial services. All of these resources are critical to enable women to protect themselves from violence. So in total, there are 13 indicators in the index, and the selection of each one is based on and supported by substantive research that validates the connection between the indicator and reductions in violence against women. Taken together, the indicators provide the first systematic, cross-country, longitudinal measure of women's safety. So why do we think this index is important for our research and practice? So we know that from research that shocks like wars or disasters often increase the levels and types of violence that women experience. We also know that societal and structural protections can reduce these risks. And the WSI helps us measure the baseline protections and how these hold up under shocks, how they buffer the effects of those shocks on women and women's vulnerability to violence. So we see that countries with stronger scores on equity, protection, and resources tend to have lower levels of reported violence against women. And these countries are also able to better prevent violence against women from worsening during crises. The WSI has 5 main aims, and let me summarize them. So first of all, it is, as we've said, a baseline assessment that allows us to track each country's foundations for women's safety and to monitor those over time, over a 30-year period. Second, it's a research platform, and it brings together secondary data from a range of different sources to support research, analysis, rapid gender assessments, as well as comparisons across countries and regions. Third, it's a crisis lens. It helps us to assess women's safety before, during, and after shocks, showing whether structural conditions can cushion impacts of disasters and conflicts. Fourth, the index has policy relevance. It can inform national and regional policy making, especially in disaster and crisis preparedness. And last, it's an advocacy tool, which we hope many of our partners will consider using. It gives civil society, donors, and international organizations a transparent, rigorous, data-driven tool to highlight gaps, mobilize resources, and push for reform. So to sum up, the Women's Safety Index is not about ranking countries. It's about insight across countries and across time. And it's anchored in both theory and evidence that can fill gaps where the information on violence against women is either missing or delayed. So in this way, it can provide a reliable and forward-looking tool to better understand and help us improve women's safety worldwide. There's 4 things that I think are really important and significant about CEVAW's WSI. In short, it's evidence-based, it's interactive, it's annually updated, and it's open access to all. With regard to the evidence base, it's the product of a multidisciplinary collaboration among a team of CEVAW researchers. We have a paper under review that supports the evidence in the index, and we have another group also working on situational and subnational analyses using the index data. We really hope more researchers will take the opportunity to download the data. The interactivity is really important. The platform allows users to interact with the data for their own purposes. You can produce data visualizations of trend analysis on any dimension, on any country or year comparison, and download it. The annual updates we are really committed to on all the indicators and the shocks data, and also to continually provide and upload the situational and subnational analyses that flow from this index. And finally, again, it's open access data, and the code base for the index is also open access. It's now my pleasure to turn to Dr. Katie Buchhorn, CEVAW's data scientist, who's led the building of this index over the past year to demonstrate its features and functionality. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Jacqui. I'm very pleased to share this body of work with you all today. I'd like to start by briefly explaining how we actually construct the index from a statistical perspective. We've selected a set of indicators. Each one acts as a proxy measure, capturing in some way, as best as possible, the underlying phenomenon we wish to understand. We then group these indicators into 3 key dimensions. Equity, which captures women's equal rights in both law and practice. Protection, which captures the institutions that safeguard women's bodily integrity. And resources, which captures women's access to social and economic opportunities. These 3 dimensions then aggregate together to form what we call the baseline Women's Safety Index. I'll just note that we chose up here equal weights to represent equal importance and to avoid biasing from various based weighting schemes for slower moving indicators, particularly in the protection dimension. So the baseline Women's Safety Index measures safety through systemic and institutional factors, and these change relatively slowly over time. But we know safety isn't only shaped by these conditions. Evidence shows that external shocks, like conflict and natural disasters, can quickly undermine women's safety. For example, by causing displacement, food and water shortages, or reduced access to essential resources. So to actually capture this, we include a measure called the impact of shocks. So this uses data on conflict and disasters to actually model how these events can cause sudden disruptions to safety, which can also last beyond the event itself. So here we use indicators defined as the percentage of population affected by disasters, as well as disaster-related fatalities, and the percentage of people living near conflict events. So just to iterate, these indicators act as proxies for the broader disruptions that come with crises. Things like loss of livelihood, food and water insecurity, and reduced access to essential services. Each indicator is scaled in proportion to the size of the population affected, helping us capture the overall extent of the disruption to women's safety. So we have the Women's Safety Index, baseline measure, and a measure for the impact of shocks, and these need to be combined somehow. So we do this by taking a Bayesian philosophy. So I'll use Bayesian terminology. So the strength of the interaction between the WSI baseline and the shocks term is unknown, and therefore treated as a random variable with a prior distribution, alpha. And for visualizations, we've chosen alpha to be 0.5. We also here include a nonlinear term to reflect our evidence-backed hypothesis that countries with higher baseline safety are generally able to better withstand or buffer the impacts of shocks. So finally, we arrive at the overall Women's Safety Index by starting with the baseline score and adjusting it to reflect the negative impact of shocks. So now let's go to the evidence platform homepage. So we built a measure of safety, of women's safety, designed to track how countries are progressing in preventing violence against women. But how does this actually compare with existing data on violence? To explore this, we take a snapshot in time and one form of violence. We're looking at intimate partner violence based on World Bank's 2018 modelled estimates. And we compare it with our Women's Safety Index baseline in the same year. And what we see here is quite a clear relationship. Countries with a higher WSI baseline score, reflecting stronger equity, protection, and access to resources, tend to have lower levels of IPV. And this is really useful because data on violence against women is scarce. And as this relationship shows, our measure can be used as a proxy. If we remove some regions, leaving only South Asia and East Asia and Pacific, we note that countries in these regions display a broad range of IPV values, making it an informative region to study and to examine how variations in safety conditions relate to violence. Also, in terms of empirical validity of the index, we ran a PCA, principal component analysis, to check how well the data supports the index structure, and details of that will be in the upcoming paper. Our index is also unique because it can be compared over time, unlike many other indices which focus on a single year and often change methodology in later versions. And it can also be compared across countries, capturing each country's distinct trajectory. So speaking of how countries change over time, let's move across to the world map to visualize this. And I'll press play. So here we're looking at the Women's Safety Index, visualized in a map view across time, where the colors change across time. The first thing my eyes are drawn to is Africa. So noting that the color scale changes from red, lower safety values, to blue, higher safety values. In the early 2000s, we note that there are improvements in the Eurasia region. South America improves at around this time in the mid-2000s, and East Asia and China coming up to 2020. We see actual values of the index change on hover as the animation continues. We can investigate and drill down further. We note that here that Africa is quite in the red, but that's for our Women's Safety Index measure, which has two component parts, the baseline and the shock discounted by shocks. So the question is it really a shock-ridden region, or are there systemic institutional failures that lead to vulnerability? So we can do this. We can toggle between the two. We can toggle, we can see what the baseline safety measure reads. And we see, indeed, there are systemic failures here. We can toggle and see the dimensions, and we note the scale here at the bottom between equity, protection, which ranges from about 40 to 90, and resources. And I will note that for resources, this has the largest scale and that indeed varies the most. And we note that the sub-Saharan Africa suffers from very low resources in particular. A country that's particularly striking here is Cambodia. And we can see here the value for Cambodia versus the value for the world average in resources. We see from 1995 to 2000, there's a large discrepancy between Cambodia's value of resources and the world average. But we see as time goes on, Cambodia's value almost catches up to the world average. So that this is quite a striking improvement. We can drill down further and go to the country profile page. Here, the pink line represents the baseline Women's Safety Index. So that is equity, protection, and resources. And the blue line incorporates the impacts of shocks. So note that the difference between the two is, another way of reading it is the difference between the two is a measure of the impact of shocks. And here we can see the dimensions of the baseline index, and we do, in fact, note that there is a stark improvement in resources for Cambodia. And we note that the discrepancy in early 2000 does, in fact, come from a shock event that consisted of a flood in 2000 affecting about 28% of the population. We can have a look at another country. Let's have a look at Fiji in comparison. Fiji's WSI is in the mid-quartiles of countries assessed globally. I'd like to just pause on 2016. We know that there is a sudden discrepancy between the WSI and the WSI baseline. And if we look at the shocks, this is owing to a tropical cyclone Winston struck, affecting almost 60% of the population. And this is a good example of how our WSI baseline, which incorporates the impact of shocks, sees a drop in safety, where otherwise equity, protection, and resources didn't reflect this. And further, if we fast forward time to the end, sometimes we note here that shocks can be confounding and their effects last well beyond the event itself. And actually modelling this helps us understand not just the impact, but the process of recovery, especially and certainly in the case here, when multiple shocks overlap and impede recovery efforts. Let's just go back to the map quickly. I did mention sub-Saharan Africa before, so let's take another look at that. Something I find quite striking here in the Women's Safety Index is South Sudan. Let's look at a country where there's a lot of room for improvement. We'll look at the country profile for South Sudan. What we'll notice here, and note the scale, the Women's Safety Index is around 20 points of 100, so very relatively low. It's moderately improving, but I would say almost flatlining compared to others. And the WSI, as you can see, here decreases, so we can scroll down to find out the details about why. We note that here, equity, protection, and resources, equity decreases, protection decreases to some extent, and resources increase, and they kind of counteract each other to some extent. And major conflicts events in about 2018 saw almost 50% of the population affected, which was indeed incorporated into our WSI measure. If we scroll further down, we can compare countries baseline to one another. So let's have a look at South Sudan, Chad, and Mauritius. So Chad in 2000, WSI score started at around 18. And in South Sudan in 2000, we're looking at around 21. But we noticed that despite Chad starting lower than South Sudan, there was indeed more of an improvement compared to South Sudan, which ended up still at around 23. Mauritius is better overall. So let's have a look into why the drivers of Chad's improvement, what really happened. We can visit the country profile for Chad. And what we see are moderate improvements across all dimensions. And further, there were still conflict events, but they have seemed to taper since 2016. We'll note the scale of equity, protection, and resources here. Equity around 40 mark, protection around 47, and resources around 17. Let's compare this to Mauritius, which falls again within the mid quartiles of countries assessed, and we can see quite a bit of a discrepancy here in terms of the scale of equity, protection, and resources, but particularly resources, which ended up at about 85. That's where the significant improvement was really driven by, in comparison to the other countries in the same region. I'll just touch on a couple of more countries. Let's have a look at Europe and Central Asia. Have a look at Ukraine. Country profile. What we'll see here is moderate improvement, but the impact of the Ukraine war in recent years can also clearly be seen. The disruption to safety is captured by our shock included measure, even though the equity, protection, and resources remain somewhat steady. As we can see here, almost 100% of the population was affected in 2024. It's interesting now to compare this to Afghanistan, where a similar magnitude of shock was experienced. And what we notice for Afghanistan here, not only is a relatively low baseline score that falls within the lowest quartiles of country assessed, but the persistent impact of conflict over the last 2 or 3 decades. We see a clear drop in safety seen in Afghanistan during the Taliban encroachment across the country since in 2018. But note that while the conflict measure was so persistent, what we actually see this drop is driven by changes in the equity dimension, changes in the baseline. I'd like to just make a quick point here, a point of comparison here. So we'll go back to 2010 in Afghanistan. So the difference between the WSI and the WSI baseline is about 16 points for a relatively low baseline score when 100% of the population was impacted by conflict. If you go to Ukraine and note that while there was 100% of the population impacted by conflict, the point discrepancy, so the impact of conflict as per how we measure it, the discrepancy is around 12. And this is to iterate the relatively smaller drop in safety, even though the shock measure was actually the same at the most extreme example of being 100% of the population affected. And this is owing to that non-linear term that we introduced before by design. I'd like to turn to the analysis and translation section of the evidence platform and point out that we have the data set available down to the indicator level, so we can understand the drivers of certain changes of dimensions. You see the data set, the entire code base, data sources, and we report on data missingness per indicator by region. And I'll just return to the map. To sum up, with this new measure, the Women's Safety Index, we can investigate how changes in the WSI scores correspond with real-world experiences during and after crises, and can generate new insights into the structural drivers of women's safety and the pathways through which shocks impact vulnerability. We hope it will facilitate new research, comparative analysis, and local, country, and regional level discussions. The dataset and the data visualization tools I've just presented on the platform seek to not only deepen understanding of women's safety worldwide, but also to support more timely, targeted, and evidence-based responses where women's safety is most at risk. Thank you. Stop sharing now.
Thank you so much for that, Katie. It is now my real privilege and honour to introduce Michelle to provide insight and reflection based on ActionAid Australia's experience in the purpose and application of an index such as the Women's Safety Index. And we would also really like to continue to encourage you to keep asking questions. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and huge congratulations to CEVAW for the launch of the Women's Safety Index. I think this is a really exciting moment. I guess from ActionAid's perspective, there's clear evidence that the climate crisis, conflict, are driving increased gender-based violence, and we see this with rising temperatures, climate-induced natural disasters. And for ActionAid, we see this in our daily work through increasing tensions in households, heightened vulnerability to violence during displacement, and increased child and early marriage as families struggle to survive after successive droughts. So it's pretty clear, and as this index highlights, increasing shocks and stresses are exacerbating existing inequalities and driving increased threats to women's safety. And our own research from ActionAid has found that there is this vicious cycle where the absence of women from decision-making results in policies and plans that are gender-blind and fail to account for women's needs in crisis. So from our perspective, the Women's Safety Index is a powerful step forward in addressing these challenges. It provides a powerful comparative global data set, and one that traverses the existing gender inequalities that women face, including things like gaps in education, employment, access to resources, alongside critical protection issues facing women and girls. And it also brings a very important lens around the impact of crises and shocks. So look, I just wanted to reflect on some of the areas where I think this could be useful, and even as I listen now, I think of so many more. But the first and most importantly from our perspective is supporting evidence-based programming. The Women's Safety Index can help us drive evidence-based and gender transformative program that will target some of the root causes of women's heightened vulnerability. It clearly highlights where there are inequities, protection risks, and gaps in access to resources, all areas where targeted programming and investment can be game-changing for gender equality and women's safety. And so for organisations working domestically and globally, the Women's Safety Index can strengthen the gender analysis underpinning our programming and support targeted, evidence-based investments in critical areas where change is needed to improve women's safety, including policy reforms. The second area where I think this can be incredibly useful is focusing on reducing disaster risk, and particularly gendered disaster risk. Protection is not always viewed as a priority within humanitarian action or as life-saving in the same way as other sectors because of the invisibility of women's safety risks, and therefore it's often deprioritised in funding decisions. Yet most humanitarian crises are protection crises, even if they're not acknowledged as such. So violations of women's rights, including abuse, violence, coercion, deliberate deprivation and exploitation and exclusion are often the drivers of humanitarian needs or further exacerbate them. So from our perspective, the Women's Safety Index helps us to better understand how women's safety is undermined in times of crisis and can provide an immediate data set that can inform more rapid response to the protection threats facing women during emergencies. The index brings these risks to the forefront and will undoubtedly help drive faster and more effective efforts to prevent risks to women's safety during crisis. And I guess I'd like to also highlight that given that only 5% of humanitarian funding is targeted to reducing disaster risk, I also hope the index will drive increased investment in women's safety before and not just during crisis. And finally, I also think it can help us make the case for more targeted country or regional investment. We've just seen the map from Katie, and pictures tell 1,000 words. While the Pacific is less visible in the global map, unless you zone in, one thing that's glaringly obvious is the African region is being left behind. It's the region where temperatures are rising at twice the global average and where extreme poverty among women is expected to grow. It's also a region that has been completely deprioritised in Australia's aid program. So I hope the Women's Safety Index can also help us make a case for more equitable global investment from donors. The map shows us that there are pockets of hope in the region, and this index provides data-driven evidence of where investments are making a difference or could have the potential to make a difference if we were to identify the gaps. And I'd say in a world where half of global aid has been ripped out of the system, this index will really help us drive smarter and more targeted investments in gender equality and women's safety in the countries and regions that are falling behind. So it's critical, particularly in averting the growing impacts of the climate crisis. So I guess in terms of what needs to happen to take some of this forward, I think those of us on this call have an opportunity to champion this index in our advocacy and our programming. I know as ActionAid, we will be thinking about this in our program design and our policy submissions to different actors. We also need to build awareness among organisations working to address women's safety, including national women's organisations, that it exists and can be a tool to inform our work as well as track progress over time. And I think for many of us, we often have very limited budgets to invest in research. So this is a great platform. Its open access will enable us to really drive a greater case around investment and some of the needs that will help address women's safety. And I guess I'd say ultimately the index creates a platform to mobilise increased investment in women's safety and rights. So congratulations, CEVAW, and thank you for this opportunity to be part of this internal launch.
Thank you so much, Michelle, as well as Katie and Jacqui for presenting the Women's Safety Index, both the aims, the way in which it can be interactively used, and as well, Michelle, for your insight into the importance of presenting such work and making it available for everyone to be able to access and use. We've had a number of questions that have come through Q&A, and we have had excellent work in the background of answering those questions. But I would like to give Katie, Jacqui, and Michelle the option, if you'd like, to maybe turn to any of those questions in case you'd like to add a little bit more nuance or detail. May I ask Jacqui and Katie and Michelle? Thanks, Jacqui. Sorry, you're on mute, Jacqui.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, Michelle, for those brilliant insights on how the index might be used. And definitely we want it to be used to direct more investment into women's safety, and especially in the context of climate-induced disasters and other crises. I just wanted to thank you also to the audience for some fantastic questions and your curiosity and interest in the index. I noticed a few questions there, one from Dr. Ha Tran in Vietnam, one of our partner investigators, also our colleague in Monash, Malaysia, or Monash, Indonesia, Daya. Thank you so much. And your questions are about the subnational use and versions of the index? And that's a really, really important question. And I think for us, it's one of the next steps. Obviously, not all countries have subnational data on all of those indicators we've presented today, but some do. And there would be an opportunity for us to deepen the index and explore some countries at the subnational level, countries like Indonesia, like India, for example, and maybe Vietnam. And I think, where there isn't all of that data, I think there is the opportunity to kind of use, to develop versions of this with what data is available subnationally, because that's very important. And as we note with shocks, disasters and conflict are often, quite confined to particular regions and areas. So it's important to do that work. We see this as just the beginning. We're really open to everyone's ideas about how we can build it further. I also noticed Jessica Gardner from UNFPA, one of our partners, point about, the shocks that are covered. And at the moment, we are just covering natural disasters, but all the full range of those, and conflict, but various types of conflict. But we would be interested in looking further, thinking about other kind of weather events, perhaps financial crises, other shocks, which I think do have, and there is evidence that they do have a demonstrable impact on women's safety. So thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement. This was a CEVAW only, all our partners and affiliates event, and you are the first that we have here to share this with you. So we look forward to you, playing around, experimenting with the platform, and sending us your feedback and what you'd like to see more of. Thank you.
Off the back of that, Jacqui, I'd like to make a comment about data missingness, as Hartran had also noticed. We didn't actually really get to illustrate the methodology behind data missingness and decisions that were made around there. So basically, where there were one or more data points, or two rather, we interpolated between those points temporally across time. Where there was no data for a particular indicator, we used either a region or income average, whatever was most appropriate for that particular indicator. Thirdly, when there was no data for, we required 7 of 13 indicators to have some form of data on it. Otherwise, we just couldn't make that much inference. That would introduce bias and be not really reflective of the country itself due to lack of data. So to avoid biasing results and have actually grounded in data, an index that is grounded in actual data related to the country, we made these decisions around data missingness, which is very similar to the Women, Peace and Security Index as well.
Katie, I also noticed a question here from Yardna, one of our CEVAW HDR candidates, and it's about Myanmar. And she's directing us, that this index could be a really invaluable tool for Myanmar women. And Yardna suggests that might it be possible to explicitly articulate the impact of the 2021 military coup when describing national shocks alongside the 2008 cyclone. You're right, Yardna, what we've done on the country situation pages is that for now we've just highlighted probably the most demonstrable impact in terms of the population impact. And I think that there is room, what we're hoping, we've already commissioned some situational analyses. And I'd like to invite you to perhaps contribute to a situational analysis of Myanmar, using the data, exploring it further. And of course, because we'll be annually updating, I think we will continue to see those impacts, the impacts of that 2021 military coup in Myanmar.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. Katie, I'm conscious that we've had some technical questions come through as well, and one in particular was a question around how the dimensions are being, the way in which they are being, I suppose, weighted. And it would be great if you might like to maybe answer that question a little further, because I know you've got to offer.
Sure. We chose, in terms of aggregating dimensions into an index, a geometric mean rather than an arithmetic mean. So a geometric mean multiplies the dimensions together and takes the cubed root. In this case, there are 3, so that smaller values effectively penalize the entire result. If you have a near 0 value and multiply any other number by it, or a 0 value to be extreme, it will be 0. So this construct was chosen by design. In terms of equal weighting, I'm referring to the indicator level. So each indicator is seen as equally important, and they aggregate together to form equity, protection, and resources. I hope was that explanatory? Was that explanation sufficient? I'm not sure.
But definitely, we've got still Q&A open for anyone who would like a little bit more detail about that. So thank you very much, Katie. And I just want to remind you again that we are definitely referring everyone to the evidence platform. You can start to explore and have a look. And I know Katie's also provided the link in Q&A, and I've provided the link in the chat as well. We now have a question on the inclusion of the inclusion and exclusion of countries in the index. One question has come in around Palestine and its inclusion in the future. And I think we can all think of not only the importance of the inclusion of Palestine, but other locations as well that are still seeking recognition as states. Jacqui and Michelle, would either of you like to answer or respond to this question?
Well, I'm happy to start. I think one of the challenges with Palestine is that it's not included in a lot of global data sets because some entities don't recognise its statehood. And so I think that's really the challenge. But I would hope in the future, and given that this is an index that will have a long-term life, that the data from Palestine will be able to come in, particularly as it starts to enter more global data sets. So yes, so let's hope it can be in there in the future. And I think this is, one thing I'd just like to say, because I can see there's a lot of questions about what gets included, what doesn't. And, ActionAid has also previously worked on an index, but was very limited to South Asia. And it can be really challenging to find global data sets, that traverse the different regions. And I think what's really powerful in this index is that it actually is looking at some of those very real protection issues, because I know that was one thing that, when we looked back to the work that we did around particularly women's resilience to disasters, it can be hard to find the right indicators to be able to really elicit some of those challenges. So I think it makes a really powerful contribution. And I think it's also exciting that this can continue to grow, and particularly even around what gets included around crises, because also, once again, it can be hard to compare across the different sort of types of crises. So I think it's making a really important contribution and a fantastic starting point for us to really tackle some of these challenges in a much more systematic way.
Thank you, Michelle. Jacqui, would you like to?
Well, I think Katie is noting we do have West Bank and Gaza on the as part of the Women's Safety Index already. So we will be looking to update that and annually update that, and we can also consider updating that with a new name of Palestine. So, Katie, do you want to add anything further there?
For conflict in particular, there are about 5 different data sources that need to mesh together, and when there are different global institutions that provide data and there's a mismatch between mapping and country borders, it's a hard task to aggregate these mismatching overlaid type of things. So we do have a baseline calculation, but where there is improvement is on basically conflict data, which I would love to see further work being done on this for this region.
A great point, Katie, and I second that comment as well. Thank you. We have some more questions, and I think we can probably answer all 3, hopefully, before we draw it to a close. So thank you, everyone, for all your questions. So Alana, also a wonderful CEVAW PhD candidate, has asked, could you please explain a little bit more about how the 13 indicators were chosen?
Yeah. Can I say a few things and maybe then turn to Katie? So ideally, our paper is under peer review, so we hope that we will be able to share that with everyone as the kind of really the sort of the defense of all the decisions we've made for each indicator and why. But a couple of things I'd like to highlight. First of all, we did actually start with a focus on the Indo-Pacific region, which we note is often an under-researched and underappreciated region in the field of violence against women. So we wanted to make sure that all indicators would reflect the conditions of women's safety in the Indo-Pacific region, which meant we needed to make sure the data was available, substantially available for every country in that region, in the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia in particular. So that was one of the criteria that we used there. And we are really also mindful that, and then we decided to go global and, and in fact, our region is probably the most challenging. So that did influence the indicator selection. And overall trying to get indicators which we had as many years as possible throughout the period, the 30-year period. So some indicators are really recent ones, and so therefore we don't get that longitudinal perspective. So, they weren't possible to include. We did substantially want to be able to have gender disaggregation of indicators. And although not all indicators are gender disaggregated, for example, electricity and mobile phone usage are not, and it makes no sense to. When we looked at that, it made really no difference in the data. And I think we tried to emphasize it here: equity, protection, and resources. And if I might say, a quick way to understand it, or a quick way to remember it is EPR. It's a bit like CPR. You have your EPR. And is that, protection, like institutional protections are really important, but so are resources, because those actually allow individuals and communities to protect themselves and to have access that allows them to protect themselves. And quite often that resources dimension is also underappreciated as a key factor in prevention of violence against women. So that was really important to us in this index. Katie, over to you.
Yes, I'd like to answer the question from Rajiv. Was there any study on confounding factors, so at the dimension level? So does higher equity lead to higher protection? So we did, this is where our empirical validation kind of came into play, and we've presented on that in the paper. So generally what we would like to see for indices is that the indicators are somewhat correlated, given that they are fundamentally measuring the same thing, equity, likewise in protection and resources, but that equity, protection, and resources themselves are independent. And we did, in fact, validate this through correlation analysis, given the data. So empirical validation for the structure of the index was actually indeed supportive of the structure that we imposed.
Perhaps I might also have a go at Kate Meacham's question. Thank you, Kate. Have you had discussions about the risk of this index potentially entrenching gender-based violence as an issue of the global south or a problem for certain races and cultures? So my first response to that is, look, we've had a lot of discussions. We've been working on this in a team for over a year. So we've pretty much discussed everything. But on this point, I would say that our focus is very much on these structural and societal conditions. And this is not about culture. And these are not specific to any one society. But it does show that, the presence of institutions and resources is very uneven, and it does affect women's safety. But those are all things that can change. Those are not, those are not related to identity. Those are related to institutions. And inequalities that are a feature, a feature also of regional and global inequalities. And maybe the other thing is that I think that you can kind of see some diversity in the index, even if you look at the world map and you see, yes, the blue and red is pretty clear in terms of those differences, but you can see great variation. Katie highlighted Cambodia and the significant progress in that country over time compared to some of its neighbours. So I think that kind of comparative analysis kind of dispels the notion that it's cultural or it's related to race or other types of identities. No, it's actually related to to the efforts of a whole society and its institutions to change the conditions for safety.
Thanks, Jacqui. Michelle, I know you also wanted to jump in here. Thanks.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we all know that gender-based violence is a global issue, but we also know that there is a vastly different situation in terms of investment in resources in tackling this issue, vastly different legal protections, and even access to resources that women have. I mean, I'm here in the Pacific at the moment, and we've been just talking about how prolific violence against women is. In the region where up to 70% of women experience violence. So I think we have to also be mindful that there are areas where and countries where huge investment is needed really to tackle what is also a crisis facing women. And I think this does give us some ability to think about what are those strategic investments that can make a huge difference for some of the countries, because there's a lot that goes in, but we need to start somewhere. So I don't think that's a danger. I mean, I think it's a great opportunity actually to really start to have more targeted investment and to start to also understand some of the resource disparities we have to tackle what is a global issue facing women.
Thank you so much. Katie, Jacqui, and Michelle, are there any final words that you would like to give before we conclude the webinar?
Thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure presenting this body of work.
So thank you so much, Katie, Jacqui, and Michelle. We sincerely appreciate the way in which you presented the index and walked us through it. Please note that there is a link on the side there in your chat, as well as in Q&A, that you can access, and do feel free to have a look at it. And if I can conclude, I would just like to make a note on 3 things that have really come through today that I think are important to note. The first is the power of knowledge, and the way in which who decides what is the priority has a lot of importance in terms of then what data we can collect, what we can know, and what we can really advocate as the needs in terms of where resource investment should be located. So I would really urge all of you to jump on, access an open access Women's Safety Index. And I want to really stress, this is at the indicator level. So we really would love you to be able to look at it, to explore, and to come back to us with any questions or comments or activities, research that you would like to focus on. We really want this to be a shared endeavour going forward. I would also like to note that when you visit the CEVAW evidence platform, you will also see the CEVAW Conversations podcast. Please follow, subscribe on any of the socials or platforms through which you access your podcasts. And then finally, I'd also like to let you know that we have attached in the chat a 16 Days of Activism shared document for all of our CEVAW network members to promote your activities and your events coming up to the 16 Days of Activism. And we'd really love to make sure that you feel like you're able to share those events with us all, so we can make sure that we are all supporting, attending, listening, and reading to each other's important work in this area. Thank you again to Katie, Jacqui, and Michelle. Michelle, your internet held up. That's fantastic. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. We really, really value your questions and your engagement. It's wonderful to see you here. Thank you so much. And also thank you, Rafat, Pew Pew, and Marielle, who were behind the scenes. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Now do we